What do you think of when you think of romance? Do you think of red roses, boxes of chocolate, perhaps even a date at the cinema? Well, they're all very modern, conventional ways of looking at it, but today's story is anything but modern and conventional. It involves a scandalous love affair, one that's perhaps one of the most romantic of its time. It involves a teenage girl called Mary and a married poet called Percy. And the story that we're about to unfold, it could almost be fiction. It could almost have come directly from the pages of a Gothic romance novel. But it's very, very true. And today we're walking through the footsteps of the very place that love first blossomed. Some love stories unfold gently, others do not. They take root in restlessness, in longing, in dissatisfaction, and the growing sense that life without each other becomes something barely tolerable. Love stories like this ask for surrender before they offer reassurance, and once felt or acknowledged, they have little regard for consequence. This is a story shaped by that kind of love, wild, insistent, and unwilling to remain contained. It belongs to a young girl named Mary and a married man named Percy. What drew them together was powerful and unforgiving, a pull that ignored circumstance, reputation and consequence. A love that crossed boundaries, and once those boundaries were crossed, there was no simple way back. This is a love that blossomed among the cold headstones of a churchyard, and one that persisted beyond breath and death, carried long after the body itself was gone. Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire, this is the Wanderlust Way. First off, let me say a massive thank you to everybody that supports this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, pressing the hype button, sending the super thanks, becoming members. Honestly, everything that you're doing is really helping things to grow here. It's allowing me to continue making videos like this. It's really helping to support me in that way, so big thank you for that. Now today we've come down south to St Pancras Churchyard in London. Now I've done this video in line with Valentine's Day. I wanted to bring a romantic story to the channel, but I wanted to bring something that was rich with Gothic drama and a little bit of history. So that's what this is about. I started digging, I found this story and I thought, yes, this is the one that you guys hopefully are going to love. So the bells are our cue. That's enough waffle, let's wander. So there is a very good reason that we have chosen to come to St Pancras Churchyard, because this is the place where Mary Godwin, who would become Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, spent a lot of her time. And there's a very good reason that she did that, because it was here that she felt closer to somebody that she'd never actually known. Mary was born in Somerstown, London, to Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneering feminist writer and philosopher, and William Godwin, a prominent political thinker and central figure in radical intellectual circles. The pair were no strangers to scandal themselves, and if truth be told, we could do a whole other episode on that alone, but that isn't what we're here for. Because what matters for this story is that many scholars agree Mary's life was already being shaped by the legacy of her parents' radical ideas, and by the event that followed next. Now, just 11 days after giving birth to Mary, Mary Wollstonecraft died from complications of that childbirth. She was just 38 years old, and although it was quite common in those days for things like that to happen after giving birth, it was still a massive loss to the family, and it would be a massive loss to Mary throughout her young life, not knowing her mother and feeling responsible in a way for her mother's death. So Mary Wollstonecraft was brought here. Her funeral took place, I believe, on the 15th of September 1797, and she was buried here in the churchyard. I've found the grave, and it looks like there's lots of people already been to visit. They've left tokens. Now it reads Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, born 27th of April 1750, died 10th of September 1797. The funeral, it is reported, was attended only by a small number of those closest to her, but not her husband. William Godwin was said to be too devastated to attend. Instead, he channeled his grief into writing, quickly beginning to work on her memoirs in an attempt to preserve her life and ideas. When his own time came, he was buried beside her here in 1836. On the other side we've got William's name, so it says William Godwin. That's really worn away. I think it must say, oh goodness, author of something justice, born March 1756, died April 1836, aged 80 years. That's harder to read, that side. And yet that was inscribed later than Mary's. So never truly knowing her mother, Mary found this place as her only sort of refuge. It was somewhere that she felt closer to her. When her father remarried, Mary's relationship with her stepmother was strained, and it's thought that she was often treated unkindly. In her writings, she described her stepmother as a woman I shudder to think of. And so, again and again, Mary retreated here to this grave, seeking companionship and comfort from the real mother she would never meet. This became a place where grief, imagination and thought could exist side by side without explanation. Writings tell us that Mary would come here alone, often with a book, sometimes to read her mother's work, and sometimes to write herself. As the two shared the same name, we are told that little Mary would trace the letters carved into the headstone, a way for the young child to learn how to spell M-A-R-Y, sketching them onto paper, spending hours beside this stone. Later she would describe it as a place where she could think freely, away from the expectations of home, society and the world pressing in on her. In many ways, this churchyard shaped her inner life long before it shaped her love life. And that matters. Because when Percy Shelley entered her world, secrecy was already familiar to her. And this place, surrounded by the dead, overlooked and rarely disturbed, offered something precious: privacy. So for Mary, death wasn't distant or absent. It had become part of her life. It had become woven into her existence as such. So I would think with that theory, the churchyard was not a macabre place for her. It was a place where she perhaps felt very safe, somewhere that she could be contemplative and process her emotions and thoughts. It would be here that conversations deepened, here that ideas were shared, here that boundaries softened, because it was here, beside this grave, that she openly admitted to falling in love for the first time. So it was into this quiet, contemplative world that Percy Bysshe Shelley stepped into, and it wouldn't be long before he would become an almost inseparable part of it, a part of her world, and even this place that she'd got so fond of too. By the time Percy Bysshe Shelley entered her world, Mary already knew this churchyard intimately. She knew its paths, its corners, the way the light shifted across the stones as the day wore on. It was a place she trusted, one that asked nothing of her and offered solace in return. Percy came first as a presence on the edges of her life, a frequent visitor to her father, William Godwin. He was drawn by admiration for Godwin's radical ideas and philosophical writings. But it was here, amongst the headstones, away from the drawing rooms and the debate, that something else began to take shape. They walked together amongst the swaying trees and the sleeping graves, often for hours at a time. Conversations stretched and softened, wandering as freely as their footsteps. They spoke of books, of belief, of dissatisfaction with the world as it was, and of possibilities beyond it. Words were exchanged quietly, sometimes whispered, as though the churchyard itself demanded discretion. There was a strange intimacy to these meetings. Among the dead they were unseen, unquestioned. The world's rules seemed to loosen their grip here. Time moved differently. Silence was not awkward, but companionable. Percy, however, did not go unnoticed within the Godwin household. According to biographer William St Clair, Mary's stepmother grew wary of him, believing he was openly flirtatious with all the young women in the home. Mary herself, her half-sister Fanny, and her stepsister Claire. There was a sense that his presence unsettled the household, that his intensity blurred boundaries, even before anything was spoken aloud. So for Mary, this place had always been associated with thought and solitude, but now it became something else as well. It became a shared space, and a secret one. Percy was said to be magnetic, expressive, emotionally unguarded, and vocal in his belief that love should never be constrained. For a young woman raised among radical ideas, his words did not shock, they resonated. Their walks became regular, their conversations deeper. Boundaries that once felt fixed began to feel strangely permeable, and with each meeting, what passed between them grew heavier with meaning. This was not a sudden lapse of judgment, nor a moment of carelessness. It was something that developed deliberately, quietly, and with full awareness of the consequences. Because Percy was married, and Mary was still only 16. Yet here, among the graves, those realities seemed momentarily suspended. The churchyard offered privacy, not just from watchful eyes, but from certainty itself. It allowed feeling to exist without immediate reckoning. And it was here, in these long secret walks among the headstones, that admiration gave way to longing, and longing began to demand something more. Now there's a reason that the churchyard keeps returning to our story, because it didn't just become a place of walking. It became a place where their emotions and what they felt for each other could no longer be contained. By late June of 1814, the bond between Mary and Percy had reached a point where restraint no longer felt virtuous, only dishonest. On the 26th of June that year, Percy Shelley would later write that he could no longer conceal his ardent passion, describing the moment between them as sublime and rapturous. It was not a flirtation nor a momentary lapse, but a declaration, an admission that what had been growing between them could no longer be denied. They were alike in ways that mattered deeply. Both were shaped by radical ideas, both were dissatisfied with the world as it was. Both believed that love once felt carried a moral force of its own, strong enough to challenge custom, law and expectation. But they were also drawn to the same shadows. They shared a love of ghost stories, of the supernatural, and the darker edges of imagination. It was a meeting of minds. And one stormy summer, gathered in the company of friends that shared fascination, would spill into something else entirely. And from it, one of the most important works of early Gothic literature would begin to take shape. It leaves a question to ponder. Would Frankenstein ever have existed had they not found one another? Mary had grown up surrounded by radical ideas. Her father, William Godwin, he was once said to have called marriage an oppressive monopoly. Now that's an idea he later on retracted. However, Mary was brought up with that idea, so that will have been in the back of her mind somewhere. So love to Mary, it wasn't meant to be obedient, it was meant to be honest. Most biographers agree that either on this day or very shortly afterwards, Mary Godwin lost her virginity to Percy Shelley. Tradition has long placed that moment here, in this churchyard, beside the grave that had once been her refuge. It was a crossing of boundaries, certainly, but it was not careless. Mary was 16, Percy was married, and both were fully aware of the scandal such an act represented in early 19th century England. Yet awareness did not lessen what they felt. It perhaps sharpened it. Desire and conviction moved together, each reinforcing the other. This was not simply lust, nor merely rebellion. It was the recognition of a kindred mind, a shared dissatisfaction, a belief that life without one another would be diminished beyond endurance. Once that line was crossed, the question was no longer how to hide what they felt, but how to live with it. And very soon that answer would take them far beyond this churchyard. Once love of this kind is admitted, it can no longer be denied. And in the summer of 1814, that was the case with Mary and Percy. They knew they had to do something about it. Even though everybody pretty much around them was against the idea, they strove forward with their romance. However, the path that lay ahead would not be easy at all. Despite everything drawing them together, the greatest obstacle remained a simple fact. Percy Shelley was not free. 3 years earlier, in 1811, he had married Harriet Westbrook. She had been 16 years old. He was 19. The parallels are difficult to ignore. That earlier relationship too had begun with urgency, with the pair eloping to Scotland. At the time of the marriage, the match appeared hopeful. Harriet came from a comfortable background and was eager, curious and keen to please. Percy, still very young himself, believed he could shape a life built on shared ideals rather than convention. Harriet showed interest in his intellectual world, in reform, in alternative ways of living, even in practices such as vegetarianism that marked Percy out as unconventional. But ideals are difficult to live inside. Percy's emotional intensity was restless, and his expectations of love and companionship were uncompromising. The realities of marriage, its routines, responsibilities and constraints, soon began to strain against the beliefs that had first drawn him to it. By 1814, the relationship was faltering, marked by distance and dissatisfaction on both sides. It was into this unresolved marriage that Mary Shelley entered. When the relationship finally came to light, it didn't go down well, and Mary's father, William, he was said to have banned her from seeing Percy. It's also said that he intersected their letters. So the life that they had imagined together was not quite going to plan. But separation did not diminish what they felt. If anything, it clarified it. What had begun as a shared belief and emotional recognition had become something lived, and neither could imagine returning to obedience without misery. And so they chose movement over silence. In the early hours of the 28th of July 1814, Mary Godwin left England with Percy Bysshe Shelley. She was 16 years old, he was 21, estranged from his wife, and already at odds with the life he had tried and failed to make conventional. They did not travel alone. Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, accompanied them. This was not an impulsive escape, it was a declaration. They crossed the Channel into France and began a journey through Europe that would test every belief they held, travelling on foot, by mule and by boat, often short of money, exposed to hardship, and far removed from the romantic ideal that had carried them there. They had chosen one another over everything, and that choice would shape the life that followed. The freedom that Mary and Percy had chosen, that freedom for them to be together, it was not without difficulty. It brought them poverty, instability and loss, and the first cost came swiftly. Their escape to Europe was not the beginning of a new life so much as a reckoning with reality. The journey was exhausting, precarious and short-lived. By the end of 1814, low on money and with few options left, Mary and Percy returned to England, their romantic escape already stripped of its glamour. In February of 1815, Mary gave birth to a baby girl, born prematurely. The child lived only a few days. The loss was devastating, and Mary recorded her grief with a restraint that makes it all the more painful to read. A few weeks later she wrote in her journal, "Dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it by the fire and it lived. I awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day." It was not simply the sorrow of a young mother, it was a confrontation with death itself, with its finality, and with the desperate, almost unbearable human wish to undo it. Love did not disappear in the face of this loss, but it changed. It hardened in places, deepened in others. What had once felt like an escape now carried weight. The ideals they had chased were no longer abstract arguments. They were being tested against the realities of living and dying. In the summer of 1816, that reckoning followed them to Switzerland, to the shores of Lake Geneva, and to the villa where they were staying. The house was being rented by their friend Lord Byron, one of the most notorious and flamboyant poets of the Romantic era, who had also fled England under the weight of scandal, gossip, and public outrage. Exile, imagination, and unsettled minds had brought them together under one roof. It was a cold, dreary, storm-bound summer where Mary found herself surrounded by brilliant, demanding minds. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, all challenging each other to write ghost stories to fill the long evenings ahead. Mary struggled. While the others spoke easily, she found herself blocked and frustrated, haunted by the sense that she had nothing to offer. And then, one night, she dreamed again. She later described a waking vision, a pale student kneeling beside the thing he had assembled, watching it stir into life. A body returned, not through miracle, but through human effort. From that vision came Frankenstein. The novel is often read as a Gothic fantasy, a story of ambition, science and horror, but it is also something far more intimate, a story shaped by grief, by birth and death, by the terror of creation and the unbearable responsibility that follows it. Mary was just 18 years old when she began writing it. Her own love story had already cost her a child. Her body had already known creation and loss. And her imagination returned again and again to the question that haunted her most deeply. What happens when we try to bring the dead back? Mary and Percy were now living near Lake Geneva, carving a life out for themselves that they had always dreamed of. But they were not alone, because Mary's sister, Claire Clairmont, joined them. Claire was ambitious, impulsive and deeply invested in literary celebrity, determined to attach herself to the world of poets and radical thinkers. Before leaving London, she had become entangled in a romantic liaison with Lord Byron, a relationship that would ultimately result in the birth of his child. Byron later remarked on the situation with characteristic bluntness. "I never loved her, nor pretended to love her. But a man is a man, and if a girl of 18 comes prancing to you at all hours of the night, there is but one way." This was the kind of environment Percy Shelley thrived in, a circle of writers and radicals exchanging ideas late into the night. He believed strongly in emotional freedom and rejected jealousy as a moral failing. Love, in his view, should not be governed by ownership or exclusivity. For Mary, these ideals were more difficult to live with. She was still very young, already marked by loss and emotionally dependent on the one relationship that had defined her adult life. While Percy spoke easily of freedom, Mary experienced its consequences more acutely. The difference between belief and lived reality began to show. Claire's presence added further tension. Rumours circulated, as they often do in small, intense communities, but what mattered most was not scandal, it was strain. Percy's attention was divided between people, ideas and ideals. Mary, meanwhile, carried the emotional weight of recent grief, uncertainty and the quiet fear of being displaced. Love had not vanished, but it was no longer uncomplicated. Still, they remained together. Mary continued to write, to observe and to endure. The relationship persisted, not untouched by difficulty, but shaped by it. This was the reality of the freedom they had chosen, and soon events beyond their control would force that freedom into a far darker light. By the autumn of 1816, the party returned to England with more than unfinished manuscripts to their names. Now this is the part in the story where tragedy really does seem to hit, and it follows them. What happens next really marks them both for the rest of their lives. Now the first blow happens to Mary and involves somebody very, very close to her in her family circle. In October of 1816, her half-sister Fanny Imlay travelled alone to Swansea in Wales. There, in a lodging house, she took her own life with laudanum. She was 22 years old. Fanny had long struggled with isolation and insecurity. She remained behind when Mary left England, watching her younger sister pursue love, travel and intellectual freedom, while she herself felt increasingly left out of the life they had once shared. Her final letters suggest deep unhappiness and a sense of abandonment. Mary was devastated. Fanny was not only her sister, but the last living connection to her mother's earlier life. Her death left Mary carrying both grief and guilt, emotions she would never fully escape. Only weeks later, tragedy strikes again, this time for Percy, because his wife, Harriet, she drowns herself in London's Hyde Park. And this is really sad because she's just 21 years old and pregnant at the time. Harriet's suicide sent shockwaves through their already fragile world. Public opinion turned sharply. Percy was widely blamed. Mary too became the focus of moral judgment and condemnation. 2 women were now dead, both young, both connected to the relationship Mary and Percy were living openly. The weight of that reality was impossible to ignore. In the aftermath, Percy and Mary found themselves facing not only grief, but scrutiny. Percy's attempt to gain custody of his children with Harriet were unsuccessful. His radical ideals, once spoken with confidence, now collided with a society eager to punish deviation. And yet, in the midst of this devastation, Mary and Percy did not separate. They remained together, not untouched by what had happened, but bound by it. Their love was no longer youthful or idolised. It was shadowed, sobered, and permanently marked by loss. At the very end of that year, with grief pressing in on all sides and public scrutiny intensifying, Mary and Percy married on the 30th of December, 1816. This marked Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin's official transformation into Mary Shelley, formalising her bond with Percy amid immense personal loss, social condemnation and the early stages of the work that would become Frankenstein. So now 6 years had passed to the year of 1822. Mary is now a wife, a mother and a published author. However, life for her is still hard. Mary and Percy were living in Italy, moving between cities over the following years. Money was uncertain, grief was constant, and both physical and emotional health played a role in their restlessness. Warmer climates and sea air were believed to offer relief, but stability remained elusive. They had 4 children together. 3 of them died young. Only one child, Percy Florence Shelley, would survive into adulthood. By the summer of 1822, loss was no longer a single event but a pattern. Mary continued to write and to support Percy's work, carrying responsibility and grief alongside devotion. In July of that year, Percy Shelley set sail along the Italian coast. He was accompanied by his close friend Edward Elliker Williams and a young crewman, Charles Vivian. A sudden storm overtook the vessel and all 3 men were lost at sea. For days there was no certainty, only waiting. Hope lingered, thin and painful, stretched out across the coastline as Mary and others waited for news. It was a familiar state by now, that terrible space between fear and confirmation, where grief has not yet been given permission to begin. Percy's body was later washed ashore near Viareggio days after the wreck. Because of local health regulations, his remains were cremated on the beach. Those present at the cremation included Lord Byron and Leigh Hunt, friends, poets, witnesses to the end of a life that had burned brightly and often recklessly. Byron later wrote of the scene in stark terms: the desolate shore, the mountains rising behind them, the sea that had taken Percy only days before. There was no ceremony in the traditional sense, no church, no grave, just fire, sand, and the sound of the waves. Mary wasn't there at the time of Percy's cremation. It was said that she was kept away, maybe it would be too distressing for her, so instead she waited inland. Percy Shelley was 29 years old when he died. Mary at that time was 24. With his death, everything they had endured together, scandal, exile, childbirth, illness, grief, was suddenly sealed. There would be no reconciliation with the future they had imagined, no softening of the past. What remained was memory, responsibility, and survival. Mary, however, did not retreat from life. She lived on, raising their son, managing Percy's literary legacy, and continuing to write in a world that often judged her harshly. She outlived Percy by nearly 30 years, a fact that would shape every decade that followed. But Percy was not entirely gone. Not from her work, not from her private life, and not from the physical remnants of that final day on the beach. Something from that cremation did not burn. Something was kept, and it would remain with Mary for the rest of her life. When Percy Shelley was cremated on that beach, something unexpected happened. Something that actually would fit perfectly into a dramatic Gothic romance novel, because it speaks about love enduring beyond death. Those present at Percy's funeral recorded that although the fire consumed his bone, flesh and clothing, reducing everything to ash, there was one thing that would not burn: his heart. Whether hardened by illness or preserved by chance, somehow it resisted the flames. What might have been dismissed as a strange physical anomaly quickly became something else entirely, a symbol too powerful to ignore. The heart was removed from the pyre and it was given to Mary. This is the moment where the story often slips into sensationalism, described as grotesque, macabre, excessive. But to frame it that way misses something essential. Mary Shelley did not keep Percy's heart out of morbidity. She kept it out of devotion. Because for Mary, love had never been abstract. It had always been physical, embodied, lived through the body, through childbirth, illness, exhaustion, desire and loss. And death did not suddenly render love polite or distant. It made it sharper. Mary kept the heart for the rest of her life. In a life where almost everything she loved had been taken, her children, her parents, her husband, this was something the world could not remove from her. Mary Shelley survived 30 years after Percy's death, and she never remarried. She dedicated her time to her work and her son, also named Percy, and she requested that when her time did come, when she died, that she be buried here in St Pancras Churchyard, a place that she loved deeply, and so that she could be near her mother and father once again. St Pancras Churchyard is where her story had begun, but Mary is not buried here. When she died aged 53 from what is believed to have been a brain tumour, her son made a difficult decision. Mary was laid to rest instead in a family vault at St Peter's Church in Bournemouth. She had never lived there, but her son had purchased a property nearby before her death, hoping the sea air might ease her declining health. By that time the churchyard at St Pancras was in a state of disrepair, and it was decided that it was no longer suitable. Yet, in an effort to honour her wishes as fully as possible, her son arranged for both of Mary's parents to be disinterred and reburied alongside her. Even in death, Mary was reunited with those who had shaped her life. After Mary's death, her son opened a box in her room. Inside, he found Percy's heart. Accounts differ in the details. Some say it was wrapped in silk, others claim it was folded within one of the last poems Percy had ever written. What is consistent is this: Mary had kept it with her until the very end. The heart that would not burn. It was later interred with her. and at last they were buried together.
So that's it. Thank you for joining me on today's romantic wander through the cemetery. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments if you heard this story before, if you already knew it, or let me know if you can think of another true romantic love story through history that's a little bit unusual, that almost feels like it could have come off the pages of a novel. Let me know in the comments because I'd love to hear it. So I've been Claire, this has been The Wanderlust Way. Thank you for watching, and take care, have a happy Valentine's Day, and hopefully I'll see you next week.